Okay, surely China's been one of the biggest loaders up on gold since 2022. Why? Is Beijing actually trying to build a post-dollar financial system and architecture?
The gold share in China's PBOC reserves currently hovers around 9% based on gold valuation. Back in 22 to 23, the gold share in PBOC's reserves was around 3 to 4%. So in a span of over 3 years, yes, China's accumulation has been spectacular. However, according to the IMF, by 2024, the gold share in the reserves of the world's advanced economies was around 25%. So let's look at this. If China were to converge simply with the gold shares in the reserves of the Bretton Woods legacy holders, that would mean a long-term structural gold accumulation for quite a long while, even more pivotal shift. China's motivation is clearly not to displace the dollar with gold. It is to sanction-proof its economy against the potential weaponization of the dollar financial architecture. Since the U.S. sanctioned the Russian foreign currency reserves in 2022, China has been preparing for two things. One is to reduce the dollar exposure, and the other is to reduce the vulnerability through the dollar financial architecture. They are not the same things, but they accomplish the same goal.
All right, so
obviously,
it's about
the latter
reducing
one is much harder to accomplish.
And vulnerability. Is there an opportunity for the yuan? We've seen the 10-year yields on yuan bonds remaining steady in that period at 1.8% during the US and Israeli war in Iran. Is the yuan building that kind of trust and stability that a reserve currency requires, or would that be stretching things too far?
Well, I don't think there is a direct correlation between the Hormuz crisis and the yuan's stability. So let me explain. There are two triggers for the bond yields stability that you mentioned at 1.8%. One is insulation and the other is deflation. So Chinese domestic bond market is actually a captive market. The foreign ownership of Chinese government bonds stands currently, I believe, at mid-10 digits and falling. So a potential Chinese government bond buyer is a bank or insurer or Chinese households who use their savings. So when the crisis happened in Hormuz, the Chinese savers cannot really divert their assets due to geopolitical risks offshore. So they are tied to one of three major investments in China: properties, stocks, or bonds. So ironically, instead of pushing the bond yields higher due to the Hormuz crisis, it's actually helped lower the bond yields in China because there is also a flight to safety to Chinese bonds domestically. But on the other hand, the bigger issue is really deflation. China has been battling deflation for the past 4 years. The latest inflation CPI reading was at 1.1%. So any sort of oil shock is not priced into the bond market simply because the fundamental issue in China is not too much of demand, rather not enough of it.
Okay, interesting. Early, I want to come back to you and look at it from the perspective of international trade, though. China-linked trade settlements in yuan grew from 13% in 2019 to 30% last year. Are we seeing an internationalization of the yuan in international trade?
Yes, of course, and beyond international trade, in global investments and even in foreign currency reserves. The RMB internationalization has been a more than decade-long story, and it reflects the aspirations of an ascending global economic power. But I must say, though, RMB internationalization is also not a destination. It is a journey. I think Professor Jeffrey Frankel has written about this topic quite extensively. The U.S. Became the world's largest trader in the 1870s. It became the largest economy in the interwar years in the 1920s. And it took only until 1945 at Bretton Woods that the U.S. became the architect of the global currency architecture and the lender of last resort. So it took the U.S. about 70 plus years to accomplish the goal to move from being the largest trader operator to the lender of last resort. Today, we're seeing the rising usage of the yuan in global trade settlement, particularly in the global south. One impetus is obviously the weaponization of the dollar. Therefore, a concerted effort by emerging economies to de-dollarize collectively. But the other interesting phenomenon is the onset of financial technological innovation. Today, with BRICS Pay,
let me bring
blockchain.
We'll get to that. Russia and China are building some of those alternatives you touched on to SWIFT. How far can they go, though?
I think between China and Russia, the bilateral trade is already fully de-dollarized. However, if we observe a recent event, which is really, really interesting, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned 5 Chinese teapot oil refiners that conducted trade with Iran. But for the first time in May, Beijing invoked the anti-foreign sanctions law. It instructed its banks to ignore the U.S. sanctions and continue to transact with the 5 blacklisted entities. And so I think this is unprecedented. I'm not sure what the signal really means. It could mean that either China thinks that the U.S. will not impose secondary financial sanctions on Chinese banks, or it's already had some levels of confidence to weather the potential calamity of a financial sanction on its banking institutions.
It started with a consensus that perhaps trust is waning in the US dollar. Does that mean an opportunity, particularly for BRICS Dedollarization talk and initiatives, a common currency? Is that political rhetoric or something that could become economic reality? In 20 seconds, let me start with Iraj.
No, I think the concept of a BRICS currency is a misnomer, a currency that wants to emerge as a trusted and held currency requires a well-defined jurisdiction with political stability and credibility. That's a soft power, and trust comes from that. And it requires an independent judiciary and a very significant one, a major share of the global capital flows that at the moment, none of the BRICS countries or any other country than the United States has.
Okay, and Shirley, your 20 seconds for a final thought on that. Is BRICS the way forward?
Yes, it is. The emerging economies will continue to transact trade with more local currencies, but the fundamental shift will be the global currency architecture that will be enabled by blockchain.
All right, and I saw Professor Frankel kind of raise your eyebrows. So I'm guessing you might have a slightly different perspective on all of this.
Well, as I said, I don't see a future for BRICS currency. And in addition to the limitations we've heard on, let's say, the renminbi becoming a leading international currency, I just don't understand how the BRICS countries would agree on a common currency, whether it would be a basket of their individual currencies or they would accept the renminbi. It just seems to me a complete non-starter.
All right, so we started with a point of consensus and we've ended with different perspectives for what the future looks like going forward.